Hello, I'm Dr. Vincent Laplaca and I'm Associate Professor of Public Health and Policy at the University of Greenwich in London in the UK. And I'm going to be doing one of the plenary presentations at ICOSS 2021. And my presentation is called Globalization and the Global Pandemic, Issues and Research. So thank you for tuning in and for listening to the presentation as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about globalization, what we see as globalization, particularly with reference to the pandemic and health generally. And then I want to move on to looking at how we see globalization in social science research at the moment, again with reference to health, illness and well-being. And after that, I would just like to conclude by suggesting some further directions in social science research where we might go in the light of COVID-19 and the global pandemic. So I would just like you to think a little bit just before I proceed on what you think globalization is. In your own countries and communities, how do you see globalization? Often and traditionally, globalization is seen as an increasing systemic interdependence of global economies, cultures, and populations, encouraged by cross-border trade in, for example, goods and services, technology, people and information. Think of Facebook, think of Google, think of Amazon and how they cross borders. Often it's argued that this leads to global governance, whereby we need global organisations to produce and develop global health and well-being policies because of this sheer interdependence. And the one that we always think about and the one that always comes to mind, of course, is the World Health Organization, or WHO. So as borders recede, people and goods are freer to move. Information, people, even stocks and shares are freer to move, and this creates new issues for global health and global social and public policy. Now, this is often conceptualized and perceived as an overarching or structural process. So globalization is an overarching or structural process which goes beyond individual action, individual subjectivity and the individual, almost as if it's unstoppable and it's uncontrollable and it can't be controlled by individuals. I would like to suggest a different way of looking at globalization and studying it as we proceed. But so keep in mind this vision of globalization as a big overarching structural process which goes beyond our minds, our consciousness, and us as individual agents, for example. Most of us are familiar with the relationship between health and globalization. As I've said, countries of all incomes and wealth face issues of migration, people movement, for example, which I've talked about. That has effects on the global economy, on health, and indeed health services throughout the world. It's often argued that for higher income countries, there is this perceived threat from lower and middle income countries of acquiring acute and epidemic infections. SARS is another big example of that, of this, this threat of moving viruses going across the globe between countries. But then this is also a two-way process, because there is also an argument that higher income countries can export negative health effects to lower income ones. For example, tobacco and fast food. And it's often argued that richer countries export fast food restaurants their own diets to developing and lower income countries, and this is what explains the increasing obesity epidemic and diabetes epidemics in countries which never used to experience so much diabetes and so much obesity. India being an example of a country with increasing obesity and issues with diabetes. So again, it's a two-way process. Now, COVID-19 has really put the spotlight on the relationship between globalization and health. Again, we often see this through a structuralist lens once again. For example, we talk about the speed of the global modern transportation, which spreads diseases. People travel across borders on boats, on foot, on planes, and it's argued they bring diseases to other countries from other countries. So modern transportation, and which is caused by globalization, spreads disease more. We talk about lockdowns, the imposition of lockdowns, particularly again on lower income countries. Lockdowns have often been more damaging to lower income countries with respect to COVID, because they have less resources to develop when they need to come out of the lockdown, and the fact that they economically suffer more than, say, richer countries and higher income countries when it comes down to lockdowns. And there is an argument that, lockdowns, particularly on developing countries and lower income countries, have been enforced by global organisations and higher income countries on them. So, lockdown has been an imposition. Supply chains and over concentration of production. This idea that when we needed lots of vaccinations and medicines, for example, countries were too reliant on each other for medicine and pharmaceutical products. And there's this argument now that countries need to take more control and bring back their supply chains in terms of medicines and pharmaceutical products, because they were too reliant on other countries, and that again is globalization, the globalization of production, which forces production out to other countries who can produce those pharmaceutical products at much lower prices, which you would argue benefits richer countries. But COVID-19 saw many richer countries lacking those medical supplies because they believed they were far too dependent, for example, on other countries producing those products. So we're now talking about things like deglobalization, the system of globalization economically and socially breaking down, this concept of vaccine nationalism and the failed attempt of the global community to mount an effective response and challenge to COVID is often seen as a real big example of deglobalization and the breakdown of global interdependence on each other. And LaPlaca and Knight are talking about what they see as globalization through equilibrium. They're writing we are writing a book chapter at the moment, which you might be interested in, which will hopefully come out next year. And we are saying that we agree with the structuralist approach to globalization and health, but we want to see an equilibrium. For example, we also want an emphasis on the contingent nature of the experience of globalization, which is agent-led, person-led, the contextual nature of global processes, which looks at how individuals can subjectively construct their lives and their lived experiences within wider global social structures. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we proceed through the presentation. So I'd like to now proceed to how globalization has traditionally been seen and researched within social science. I've argued, haven't I, here that globalization is often approached through the lens of structures and systems and systemic interdependencies, and often how they interact with other and wider dominant structures and systems. For example, capitalism and wider structures of social and economic inequalities and health inequalities, such as maybe racism or for feminists, patriarchy. I believe that this is rather too foundationalist. It presents abstract structural systems and theories of structural systems as a reality in itself, but it has very little empirical data to support it, very little reference to empirical data that would support that. And very little data that might look at individual subjectivity and human action within those abstract structural systems. And Laplace and Knight are arguing that empirically it's very difficult to produce evidence of large-scale historically existing social structures which have perhaps existed for hundreds of years. And it's very difficult to produce them and also be able to account for human autonomy, human relationships, human subjectivity, the local, the community context perhaps of health inequalities, and the concept of globalization through equilibrium. So we're not altogether arguing that theories of large-scale structural systems is wrong or it's not appropriate, but we must go down to a more grounded, contextual, less foundationalist level so that we can understand human beings, human actions, human consciousness, and human interpretation within those wider social structures. So there's some things to think about. There's a lot of things to think about there, isn't there, in terms of how we conceive of globalization, structures, systems versus more micro systems and interpretation, and how people on a micro level, on a subjective level, interact more with those wider, more structural systems that we refer to always in social science, and they're still very important when we're looking at oppression and large-scale health inequalities and disparities between people. So I would just like to spend the remaining time of this plenary presentation to look at further directions in social science research. So, I've criticised the structural systems and suggested other approaches. Where might we go? Where do you think we might go in terms of further directions of this? I think we need to move away from perspectives which only seek unalterable and homogeneous perspectives of globalization and global health, which are more complex because they are much more complex. So we move away from those large-scale systemic overarching structures. We still maintain a durable place for those systems theorizing perspectives, but we do it within a more complex empirical analysis of globalization on, for example, as I said, the local level, the contextual level, the relational level in terms of economics, health and well-being. So we go down to the ground again. We look at individual consciousness, human action, how human beings construct their lived experience of globalization, of health inequalities, of health and well-being generally. So there is a move to qualitative, hermeneutical and Weberian social action orientated methodologies which look at the social construction of meaning, the relational structure of meaning, how we socially construct discourses and meanings around health inequalities, around experiences of globalizations. So we keep the more traditional quantitative methods, structural quantitative methods that are aimed at discovering large-scale structural realities, through a numerical and statistical basis, but we also need to go down on the ground, and we also need to contemplate meaning, human experience, lived experience of social structures. And I'd like to introduce you to some examples of this. Now, we often talk about globalization, health, and communication on a large-scale structural level. We look at large-scale structures of social media, how that influences us. And again, I've talked about Amazon, haven't I? And I've talked about Facebook and social structures of communication. But what I think we should do in order to complement that as well is to think about could we also do research, for example, which focuses on the more micro level, which brings us down to a more grounded theory, human interactionist, subjective level. I would suggest perhaps that we might want to focus upon how young people perceive. It could be anybody, not just young people, but young people are just an example, how they use social media, and maybe its impact upon their mental health and well-being as they negotiate social media circuits across different global websites and social groups and even countries, and the contiguous nature between those events across place and time. So we need to think about how we might do research that gets to that more grounded level theory, the micro level theory, to see how people construct that lived experience of use of social media, perhaps its impact on mental health or even physical health within those wider structural dimensions that I've already talked about. I would also suggest, for example, and I have already, rich and detailed qualitative interviews, anthropological research, ethnographic research can help us with this. For example, what about looking at women's perceptions of the uses of contraception, for example? In different countries and different societies, maybe their perceptions of female genital mutilation, other sexual health and well-being issues. So we could focus on that, and by focusing qualitatively and with a lot of detail using ethnographic and qualitative approaches, that can shed light on, for example, local or otherwise patriarchal attitudes to women and their origins, which sometimes come from more structural domains of culture. We could look at how women creatively organise resources to empower themselves in all women's spaces, with reference to women's sexual health and women's well-being. Perhaps we can look at how women construct their lived experience, specifically with regards to health and well-being, by using and applying this type of more qualitative ethnographic orientated research. If we do this type of less foundationalist research, more qualitative, more interactionist, micro level approach, this would enable other researchers to compare this with similar studies, and then we could build up global perspectives from women's points of view, and that could be grounded within, for example, feminist frameworks. So we don't dispense completely with notions of wider culture and wider systems, but we look at how humans construct their world, their lived experience. And we create more empirical data in order to be able to complement those more wider structural systems, which are often based on assumptions, I think, more than actual empirical and data reality. So to conclude, I think we should build that bridge between theory, evidence and action, and whilst also refining and illustrating current frameworks in global public health, i.e. the more structural ones. we design research which complements them both theoretically and methodologically. And this would render a multi-layered perspective to empower people and ensure that people's voices are articulated by means of wider global perspectives. So, we get global perspectives from across the world. We get local and contextual ones, but we can build that up into a global domain as well. And agency and consciousness and empowerment from individuals' perspectives is stressed with this, as well as more empirical confirmations and contiguities between them. So I hope I've given you something to think about and something useful also to think about with regards to the concept of globalization and its relationship with health. Thank you very much for listening. Please get in touch with me on the laplaca@gre.ac.uk if you'd like more information or you'd like to talk more about this. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference and I wish you well in your future research and your future careers. Thank you very much.